Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the situation in Ukraine with Nina Khrushcheva, a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and a great-granddaughter of the former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Dr. Khrushcheva, this spring marks 60 years since your great-grandfather handed Crimea, a peninsula of great historic and strategic and military significance for Russia, over to Ukraine. And I know there are many theories about why he did it, but historically speaking, that was meant to commemorate the unity of Russia and Ukraine. And administratively, Crimea was never supposed to be cut off from Moscow. Now, I wonder if the geopolitical battle over Ukraine that we are witnessing at the moment would have been less tense if Crimea wasn't part of the question. How strategic it is for both sides, I mean, for both Russia and the West.
Well, I think when Khrushchev transferred it from the Russian Federation within USSR to Ukrainian Republic within the USSR, it was really not strategic or geopolitical in any way, because all of them were, it was like moving checker pieces from one part to another. I think it became very strategic and important in 1991 when Ukraine became an independent country, and so there was a process of figuring out how to take Ukraine back under the Russian control. I think that in some ways, the fact that the fact that Crimea is now sort of the center of the battle between the pro-Western, as they're called, protesters in Kiev, and the Russian forces in Russia is almost a gift to Vladimir Putin, because he can localize his, as we discussed earlier in the program, and I put it in quotes, expansionist powers.
Dr. Khrushchev, just out of curiosity, I mean, Russia is often described as a status quo power, and just before these protests broke out, you know, Vladimir Putin didn't have any problems with either Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian people, or the location of the presence of Russia's naval base. After all, the lease runs until, I think, 2042, so I simply don't see how you would connect that instability that we are now seeing in Kiev to Vladimir Putin. He had everything going for him anyway before those protests broke out.
Oh, of course, he had everything going for him. He just won the Sochi Olympics. He showed the world what he can do. And I think the Crimea, I mean, he's a brilliant politician of opportunity. He really takes an opportunity and seizes on it, not that he necessarily have great strategic plans. It seems like the Crimea was that maraschino cherry, you know, we have on top of ice cream. And so I think that's really what has happened. And I think he did say, though, that he doesn't have problems with Ukrainian people, and I don't believe he does. But it was an opportunity for him to get Crimea back, to show that he's a uniter of former lost territories. When leaders like Khrushchev or Yeltsin, Khrushchev gave it away, Yeltsin didn't claim it back. And so it adds to the greatness of Vladimir Putin and the possibility of his great Russia that he is going to rule forever.
Well, I wonder what greatness you're actually talking about, because he is now under an avalanche of international criticism over all of that. And, you know, you alluded to him trying to annex Crimea as a, you know, a pickled cherry on the top of his favorite Olympics, but he actually said a couple of days ago that Russia has no interest in annexing Crimea. He said it publicly, and I think he perfectly understands that something like that would be an extremely challenging and extremely costly move given the modern-day geopolitics. Now, I would like to ask you something different, though. The Crimean authorities just recently announced their intention to hold the referendum on March 16th to ask their people whether they want to stay within Ukraine. So I wonder if you think that there is any compromise here that would both satisfy, or rather protect, Ukraine's territorial integrity, protect Russia's national interest in Crimea, because this is, after all, Russia's main warm water naval base, and it is strategically extremely important for the Russian Federation, but also be palatable for the West. Is there any sort of compromise here that would satisfy all three sides involved?
I think it is already a compromise. I mean, as you said, he said that he doesn't want to annex. I mean, I'm so glad that you take Putin's words at face value. I don't. But I'm sure when he says he doesn't want to annex, it's exactly for that matter that he's quotable as a non-aggressor, so good for him. The second point is that I do love the fact that all these troops that are there, and I was on a show with Vladimir Pozner, a very famous Russian journalist, who said, "Oh, we don't really know. It hasn't been proven that they're Russians because they are without insignia, even if they do speak very good Russian."
Well, everybody in that part of the world speak very good Russian. That's not an argument.
No, that's really not an argument, absolutely. But all their equipment actually has Russian signs.
Well,
and
Russia
Russian,
sells equipment to that part of the world as well.
Whatnot. Okay, may I please finish? Thank you so much. And I think that really gives Putin a great leeway, just as you suggested. So they say Crimea runs a referendum, and the referendum decides that Crimea perhaps wants to be part of Russia, which of course is a very interesting referendum because you would be run with the boots of the ground that are technically not Russian, but so obviously Russian.
But come on, the majority of people there are distinctly pro-Russian. I don't understand why do you make such allegations of supposedly Russian troops harassing people into agreeing or into voting a particular way on the referendum, because you know full well that they are pro-Russian by their ethnicity and by their ideology to begin with.
Right, and with the boots of the ground, clearly that makes very, very free referendum. So the referendum happens, the world screams that that's not a legitimate one precisely because they're boots of the ground, and they probably could be a compromise with Kiev depending on how Kievan authorities continue to behave in this regard. So there is an opportunity to make a palatable decision on this. That is, technically it has great authority from Ukraine, doesn't really disappear from Ukraine's territory, but mostly would be under the Russian control.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Khrushchev, you just suggested that this whole Ukrainian debacle was sort of Putin's evil plan, and I would like to offer an alternative theory here. I already mentioned that Crimea is extremely strategically important for Russia, but if we focus on the military aspect of it, if Russia were to lose its naval base there, wouldn't it be a major gain for NATO? Could that be the end game on the part of the West here?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that NATO really holds Russia as a great enemy. I think it's the other way around. I think Russia holds NATO as the great enemy.
Well,
and
Russia has seen NATO creeping towards its borders.
I'm not entirely sure that Putin has an even plan. As I mentioned, I think he's a great tactician. I don't think he's a good strategist, because in the long run, this is really not a viable solution of how to take parts of former territory, claim them back. Once again, I do believe that Russia sees NATO in a much more evil terms than the NATO actually, at least until very recently, did see Russia. In fact, my suggestion all along was when Russia was screaming hell when NATO was admitting other countries into its territory, Russia should have come with the flowers and suggested to NATO, take us in, and then imagine that the NATO would have collapsed altogether.
Now, I've heard you state on other TV networks that Russia and Putin in particular have to be punished for what you call Russian invasion of Crimea. And as one of the possible forms of punishment, you suggested a visa ban, not only for the Kremlin-connected oligarchs, but actually for the entire Russian population. And that really strikes me as a sort of flashback to old Soviet times when the authorities really restricted the freedom of movement. It seems that the measures you're suggesting are very authoritarian. Don't you think so?
No, I don't. I don't think it's authoritarian in any way, because I am not suggesting, as somebody who sits in the Kremlin, to stop stop the travel of my citizens. It's a suggestion of an analyst. It's a suggestion of not somebody who has power sitting in the Kremlin and actually closes borders. And my suggestion for that is that the minute visas are blocked for many ordinary Russians, you know, it could be kind of a thing that would slightly force Putin out of the Kremlin faster than anything else.
Dr. Khrushchev, what you're suggesting is essentially punishing 143 million of Russian citizens for the actions of one man. Even if you dislike him, regardless of whether you like him or not, it seems to be you know, a pretty tall order to trample on the freedom of movement for such a large population. Now, something else I think that you also suggested that was kind of from the you know, Soviet playbook. You said the other day, I think, in the interview to MSNBC, that Putin is essentially borrowing tricks from your own great-grandfather's playbook, and you compared the situation in Ukraine and to what happened in Hungary back in 1958. And I would like just to remind you that back then, some 2,500 Hungarian citizens were killed, and some 700 Soviet soldiers, if I'm not mistaken, lost their lives in that Soviet invasion of Hungary. Aren't you ultimately using the sort of the boogeyman of the Soviet Union and, by extension, your own great-grandfather to make a political point?
First of all, of course, in my interviews, I do make this distinction that Russia is not the Soviet Union. I'm talking about the invasion to stop certain political developments that are not favorable in the Kremlin. In 1956, Khrushchev was protecting communism around the world. He was afraid that communists, as he was told, would be hung on trees. And Putin's argument today about humanitarian intervention on behalf of the Russian citizens is something very similar. And as for, let me just reply to the punishing of the whole country. Look, if Russia cannot behave and figure out its relationship with its own president, I think we all should take responsibility for that.
Well, I think Russia's relationship with its own president are pretty clear. I mean, you only need to have a look at Putin's approval ratings, which have been pretty consistent over the past decade or so. But when you were talking about the modes of behavior appropriate for modern-day powers or countries, I think, again, you only need to look at the country where you are currently residing to see that humanitarian interventions are sometimes used pretty casually in foreign policy under all sorts of pretexts. But unfortunately, Dr. Khrushchev, we have to leave it here. I really appreciate you appearing on the show. And to our viewers, please keep the conversation going on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.